Hello. Thank you so much, Tufts University, for having me. And thank you to College of Freedom Forum and the amazing, wonderful people here from the Human Rights Foundation. My name is Faisal Al Mutar. I grew up in an academic family. The last child, so I'm the youngest. We actually have a term in Iraqi. It says the last grape and the most loved person of the. So I got a lot of love from my mom growing up, so I don't need that much attention. I grew up in a family of 7, as I said. My dad is a doctor, my mom is a lawyer. 2 of my siblings are engineers, and 2 of them are doctors, and I'm the failure. So I would say that my life is defined to 3 main chapters. The first chapter of it is actually under the regime of this guy, which I think some of you are here young enough not to remember, but his name was Saddam Hussein. And you might actually have seen him in an episode of South Park, where he's dating the Satan. But I've lived under the real Saddam Hussein, who was not dating Satan, but I guess he was Satan himself. What was that like in practice? I always say that there are 2 major things, I would say 2 memories of that regime as I was young growing up in it. First, 1 out of 4 adults were members of the intelligence services. So the intelligence services are called the mukhabarat. They're known for their brutal killing, mass detention, etc. So what that makes, so imagine if you have 1 person out of 4 adults in the intelligence services, you start becoming afraid of your own family. Because you're now thinking that, okay, if I say something here, my colleague in work will report me to the intelligence, my family. In fact, there were stories after the fall of the regime of people having divorces because they thought their main partner was part of the intelligence. So authoritarianism in Iraq under Saddam's regime was not just physical, which I'm sure many of you, if you do any research, you'll hear about the mass graves and the chemical weapons used against the Kurds and etc. But authoritarianism in Iraq was also mental, is that you start becoming afraid of your own soul. The other thing that I would like to mention, which is done a lot of research, is that in the 90s, when I was growing up, there were more books that are banned than read. He had an absolute control of the sources of information. We had 2 major channels. And if you're caught in sometimes having satellite channel or internet from the outside, you might end up in jail and sometimes afraid for the rest of your life. Then the second chapter of my life, when the United States came in, and that's where the Iraq War, and my memory of that was, so my dad being a doctor, we actually relocated to West Baghdad, and we grew up in a residential neighborhood. And my memory of that era was we turned from a neighborhood that kids used to play soccer. I guess Americans, yeah, we call it football, but you guys call it soccer, in the streets, into absolute chaos, and in which dead bodies became the norm, kidnapping and killing became everyday scenery. So what happened? So that's what the title of my talk is, the lessons of the war. And now, of course, I'm talking about things in hindsight. I mean, I always forget that the war actually happened almost 22 years ago. So now, as I'm in my middle 30s, actually, I've lived more years after the war than before. So this is like a lesson from somebody who actually lived pretty much all of it, and I'm still a regular visitor to Iraq. I have, in fact, 2 offices of my organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, over there, so I'm still very actively involved in the country. And I would say the first lesson is that you cannot bomb democracy into countries. That is the first important lesson, I guess, we're now learning in hindsight, is that you cannot just bomb it. And most importantly, especially in a country that never have any history of democracy. So I'm going to give you a brief history version of Iraq. Iraq as a civilization has existed for thousands of years. I'm sure you've heard of Babylon and Assyria and Acadia and all of that stuff, the Ottoman Empire. But really as a nation, it only existed after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. What we now know of as Iraq with its borders and was actually established after the British and the French divided the Middle East and what's what and what's Syria and what's Iraq and stuff like that. So as a nation, what we think of as Iraq is only been 100 years old. And it started with a king, whose name is King Faisal, who was named after. And the king was killed by the communists. So his son was beheaded by the communists. And then the socialists killed the communists. And then Saddam Hussein was killed by the Americans. That is the history of Iraq 101. So from a political landscape, we've never had any history whatsoever of democracy, which is very different. You're going to hear from Felix, you're going to hear from people in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America, in which they had a glimpse of at least some idea of democracy before, and they transitioned to authoritarianism. We actually had the unique feature which we never had a democracy to begin with. The third lesson is that it's very hard to build a democracy when everybody around you is authoritarian. So one of the challenges that we still currently have in Iraq, and we had it from the beginning, is that when we were transitioning to what's now called democracy, is that the countries around us, from Iran to Syria to everybody else, wanted to make sure that we become a failed state, that's not going to trickle down into the rest of the region. Because if Iraq would become successful, then the people of these countries will demand dignity, and they will not change. And places like Iran, and we actually have a lot of historical connection to Iran because of our religious connection, they will see, okay, these are people who look like us, and they have democracy and freedom. How come we don't have it over here? So Iran made sure that Iraq becomes a failed state. And then as a result of the war, and there's a term that was established after World War II called denazification. So when the United States came into Germany, they took off the Nazis. In Iraq, we had depathification. So all of the people who were part of the former regime actually could not work anymore. So think about that. All of the people who actually have institutional knowledge, and now we're talking about institutions, are no longer able to work. So we actually had people who came after the war who have zero expertise and zero knowledge of how to manage a country whatsoever. They cannot even manage their own households, leave aside managing a country of 40 million people. So what happened was an entire destruction of the institutions. Leave aside the institutions of democracies, but the institution of the state itself. So what that led to? It led an entire fracture of the Iraqi identity, and one of our board members, Steven Pinker, who talks a lot about evolutionary psychology, is that we actually went to our own basic instincts, which is the tribal and sectarian identity. And that's why, so the moment that state, because the identity was actually attached to the state, and the moment that state was destroyed, there was no identity anymore. Everybody went back to their Sunni background, Shia background, Kurdish background, Arab background, because the concept of state was removed. And for me, democracy, so one of the lessons, again, of the Iraq War is that when George W. Bush made that famous speech of mission accomplished, number one, which obviously wasn't, and the other thing was that we now have democracy. But the picture of that democracy was just people voting. But democracy is not just about voting. It's not just about the elections or the illusion of an elections. It's about institutions. It's about the rule of law. And most importantly, and that's, I would say, most important lesson from Iraq, is the concept that other humans have as many rights as you do. And that is something that Iraq, when the state was dissolved, everybody went back. I remember my dad voted in the first elections in 2005, and everybody was voting purely on their sectarian lines. And that's why you see the democratic elections in Iraq, is that if the Shias are 60%, you have 60% Shias in the parliament. You have a much amount of Kurds that reflect the ethnic. So we don't have, so technically the democracy is just a version of either mob rule, which is the majority kills the minority or persecutes the minority, or people just voting to protect themselves from the other guys, right? It's like, I'm gonna vote for this party so this other group will not kill me. So growing up with all of that is, you had two choices. You either submit, which is like, there's a term in Iraqi which is called sha'layya ma'layya, which is, I have nothing to do with this, I cannot do anything, or do something. And that's what I started my organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, which has, as I said, active offices in Iraq, in both federal and the Kurdistan region. And knowing with all of kind of this context, the first thing we focused on is really making democratic knowledge available and accessible. Is that people cannot fight for democracy and any of these ideals, which I think gotta be shared at this event, if they don't know what this even mean. Right? When people talk about democracy, do they even know the definition? Do they even know the concepts of individual rights or the concept of freedom of speech? What does even freedom of speech even mean? So our first mandate was making this knowledge accessible. And to our surprise, and this was kind of like a spontaneous project, we grew from 0 subscribers to now 8.5 million subscribers, not just from Iraq, but all the way to Morocco and many people in that region, in fact, outside the Arab world as well, including in the Kurdistan region and in Afghanistan and Iran, which shows, first of all, that there is actually a demand for this, especially among the young generation who did not grow up with what I call the authoritarian mentality that I was talking about. Like my parents and the generation with them, my mom and dad at least grew in 5 wars in their lifetime. For us, we grew up only under 2, so we're actually in the good side of things. So the first thing was education, and the second thing was empowerment, which actually support the voices and not impose the voices, but support them. So this is one of the people that we have supported, and Al-Ansari, who is a very dear friend of mine, met in my last visit. He said that it's not just a war of weapons, but a war of words, ideas, and narratives. So I have 2 lessons for you guys. As some of you, I'm guessing, are studying international affairs and all of that. First is that when you try to change a country, think about, the first question is that, are we supporting the local voices, or are we trying to impose our own version of progress? Number 2, are we supporting to create self-sustaining institutions, or institutions that collapse the moment we withdraw? I mean, Iraq looks like a Switzerland compared to Afghanistan, in which we all saw the pictures of people falling from planes, and the entire institutions of Afghanistan fell apart the moment the US military fell. And then you have another picture, which is from the fall of Saigon. So this is not new that these institutions or democratization efforts have been attempted and failed. So my talk today is about these lessons, but most importantly is that the Iraq catastrophe, is that it's a lesson of humility. And before we even start to interfere in any country, the first thing we have to do is to listen. Thank you so much. And if you're interested in our organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, you can join us, and you can see I'm approachable. You can talk to me anytime you want. Thank you so much, Oslo, College of Freedom Forum, and Tufts. Thank you.